This is the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.
So when I've taught Federalist 23 before, my students are always taken aback. And it acts a little bit like, what's that thing called? The brainalyzer from Men in Black.
Oh.
It makes them totally forget everything they've learned about American government as they're bewitched by Publius's argument. And what I mean is that when they've learned about the way that the structure of the Constitution limits government, and when they've learned that the vigilant and manly spirit of the people can limit government, that all seems to be totally erased in the argument in Federalist 23, that at least if you're only reading a few paragraphs, particularly I'm thinking paragraph 5, is the means ought to be proportioned to the end. How many times have we heard those words in the mouths of the most vile tyrants who would gather up all power within their hands for the most nefarious objects? Where did limited government go? That is the initial reaction one can have reading Federalist 23 if one's not attuned to its place within the larger body of work, if one's not attuned to the ways in which, even implicit in this paper, limited government is operating.
And that's a great point. And I would add, the defects of the Articles of Confederation must be kept in view. And that's contextually where we are in the Federalist Papers. So let's turn to Fed 23, Aaron. It's great to see you yet again. So let's talk about it a little bit. There are a few statements in 23 that are very unique. You've pointed out this way of means and ends thinking. We have the word responsibility said for the first time in the Federalist Papers in Fed 23. And we also have a tiny discourse on self-evident truth here. So Fed 23 is a marvel, I think. It is about the need for a government at least as energetic as the one proposed. Let me add this. Keep in mind that Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution says, the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government, and shall protect each of them against invasion, and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened, against domestic violence. That's a tall order. How is it that you're going to own up to it? Federalist 23 offers us some answers.
And you're right to note that it comes in its proper sequence after the defects of the Articles of Confederation. But rhetorically, this essay doesn't seem to pull any punches. It begins the necessity of a constitution at least equally energetic with the one proposed to the preservation of the Union is the point at the examination of which we are now arrived. So in past, we've seen Publius structuring his arguments, let's say not revealing that we're going to discuss an energetic executive in his list of topics in Federalist 1. Now he seems to have done the proper groundwork, ready to pull out something that might be pretty shocking.
So why do you need energetic government, Aaron? I think Publius would offer us an answer along the following lines. He would ask us to consider what it is that we're trying to achieve. Then he would say, what is the quantity of power or extent of the power needed to achieve this? And then he would ask us to consider, on whom will this power operate? Who are the recipients of this power? Publius speaks of power in the singular and powers in the plural. He says power in the singular 7 times and powers 9 times. He says, I think what's most interesting on this line, the people delegate powers to the government. A nice little reminder of the sovereignty of the people, that all of this is consent-based. The people themselves possess these powers and are delegating them to government. That's in paragraph 11.
It's consent-based, Mike, as you say. It also places in the people's care the responsibility for limiting this government. He says, a government, the constitution of which renders it unfit to be entrusted with all the powers which a free people, this is emphasized, ought to delegate to any government, would be an unsafe and improper depository of the national interests. So if this government, which is, at least theoretically, we're talking of number 23, unlimited with respect to the powers which ought to be invested in the national government, then the responsibility falls on the people for making that limitation, for not entrusting to the government powers which it ought not have. Of course, that raises a question, again, about what kind of powers ought the national government to have commensurate with the ends to which he specifies in this essay.
And that's what Fed 23 is going to teach us. Let me make one more point about power and means and ends before we turn to the text proper. There's a wonderful natural science or physics point of view here. It's wonderful. You said earlier,
in paragraph 5, the means ought to be proportioned to the end.
The means ought to be proportionate to the end. The power needs to be proportionate to the end, to what you're trying to achieve. So we have a few forms of power here. We have power in the people, as by nature, in the form of their very consenting to be governed and these powers which are delegated. And then we have power in the government to secure the people from each other, maybe from nature, if you want me to say it that way. And in light of necessity, in light of the security, that is a fundamental end of government. Government must possess a remarkable amount of power. Now, paragraph 3 contains a statement on the purpose of the union. Notice here we're speaking of union and not republican government. Let's look at paragraph 3. The principal purposes to be answered by union are these: the common defense of the members, the preservation of the public peace, as well against internal convulsions as external attacks, the regulation of commerce with other nations and between the states, the superintendence of our intercourse, political and commercial, with foreign countries. So union for the purpose of defense, internal peace, commerce, and diplomacy. I've already said it today. I'll say it again. This is a tall order. You have a lot of responsibilities. Now, these are the purposes of the union, but they are not the purposes of all of the Constitution. Publius will show us that happiness and the common good are also ends of the Constitution. But what comes first? What always comes first? Security. Said differently, what comes first? The military. We have to get this right in order to own up to our other ends of happiness and the common good.
Yeah, this reminds me of the argument that we looked at, and I think it was number 17, where Publius says that the great aren't going to want to mire themselves in the humdrum affairs with administration and local municipal government, that political greatness is attracted to some of these ends that Publius is mentioning in number 23, particularly, I think, common defense, preservation of the public peace, as well as internal convulsions as external attacks. Maybe Hamilton was one of the few great men concerned with regulation of commerce. So if we're combining those arguments, we're going to see that we're going to put in the hands of the people who have the most ardent love of glory and desire for fame pretty significant amounts of power.
Let me add to this too. Diplomacy is pretty enticing. The bigwig foreign powers are coming over here. They're coming to my house. That's very tempting. It seems it should be lower, but it's also a recognition of your stature, of your importance, and think of how much, to use this word as we would use it today, power you are wielding when you're dealing with diplomacy in this way.
And so he has to give a good justification for why we're going to be investing so much power in the government. And let's look at the example that he chooses. He doesn't talk about the regulation of commerce in the ensuing paragraphs. He doesn't discuss the superintendence of our intercourse with foreign countries. We're going to lean on the common defense. Because like you said, Mike, safety is first. In the first couple essays of the Federalist, we looked at self-preservation, at survival, at safety as being the means by which we are allowed to do everything related to prosperity. Without safety, you have nothing.
So I'll take a look at paragraph 4, where these authorities are discussed. This is paragraph 4 of Federalist 23. Publius says, the authorities essential to the care of the common defense are these: to raise armies, to build and equip fleets, to prescribe rules for the government of both, to direct their operations, to provide for their support. So those are the authorities needed to own up to the purposes of keeping us safe. Look at how narrow, to the point, this statement is. Publius goes on. These powers ought to exist without limitation, because it is impossible to foresee or to define the extent and variety of national exigencies and the correspondent extent and variety of the means which may be necessary to satisfy them. The circumstances that endanger the safety of nations are infinite, and for this reason, no constitutional shackles can wisely be imposed on the power to which the care of it is committed. This power ought to be coextensive with all the possible combinations of such circumstance, and ought to be under the direction of the same councils which are appointed to preside over the common defense.
About emergency. You don't know what's coming down the road. You do not know what your enemies are plotting against you. You don't know, and you cannot prescribe at a constitutional convention what powers you are going to invest in government to be able to check a variety of emergency scenarios that you cannot imagine. And so you have to give, as he says, unlimited powers without limitation, because that you cannot foresee or define the emergencies that are coming.
Yeah. Limited government seems impossible. It seems foolish. How can you have limited government when self-defense requires unlimited power? How can you have limited government and liberty when the necessities of self-defense erode all limits of constitutional government? I mean, just think about how much power the executive has used during, for instance, World War II, and also thanks to the Patriot Act. Well, there's an answer. The answer, of course, is the separation of powers. We will eventually see, by Federalist 47, the separation of powers take this on by putting so much of this energy in the executive and also putting the power of the purse in Congress. Federalist 23, all this talk of the military, you would think surely is thinking of the executive, and that is correct. But Publius will go on also to help us understand that this is about government having the means to secure the military. We'll get there soon enough. Let me point out one more thing. Notice that no constitutional shackles, says Publius, can wisely be imposed on the power to which the care of it is committed. So this is about taking care of the Constitution. You shouldn't put constitutional shackles on the Constitution, which is to take care of the Constitution. So you ratify the Constitution in order to secure yourself. Now you need to make sure that the Constitution has the powers to secure itself, because in doing so, it should be able to secure you. So don't shackle the Constitution. It must be open to the nature of the world, full of all of its exigencies. This is as realpolitik as it gets.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, as you do, he does not qualify the argument here in terms of the separation of powers. We're going to get in a later paper, he says, the persons upon whom this power ought to operate. But right now, we get the argument for unlimited government in its most unvarnished terms. It's not as if he's going to qualify it as it goes on. And I'm thinking about limitations on government. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lays out enumerated powers for the legislature. Article 1, Section 9, the following article, says what the Congress cannot do. And there's almost nothing in that article related to brooking the government's ability to ensure security in the common defense. The only thing that I think stands out there is that the writ of habeas corpus will not be denied. Of course, that is a timely limitation on government, but it's the great writ is never irrelevant.
In complete agreement with you. For now, instead of worrying about the separation of powers, we are to see the limitations of limited government in the face of unlimited threats. The presentation here in Federalist 23 is on the necessity of an energetic government. All of government seems energy. When you think government, think energy. When you think energy, think government. And understand that the critique of limited government as possessing limitations is a critique of the Articles of Confederation here. So while Publius will establish limited government through his constitution, here the critique of limited government is a critique of the Articles of Confederation, which are impotent. Paragraph 5 helps us see this more clearly.
And especially in the mechanical language which you mentioned earlier. This is one of those truths which to a correct and unprejudiced mind carries its own evidence along with it, and it may be obscured but cannot be made plainer by argument or reasoning. It rests upon axioms as simple as they are universal. The means ought to be proportioned to the end. The persons from whose agency the attainment of any end is expected ought to possess the means by which it is to be attained. And like you said in invoking the executive earlier, here we see the person from whom the attainment of the end is expected. Now, in matters of commerce, regulation of commerce, we might think that's Congress. But all of the great objects mentioned in paragraph 3, like the preservation of the public peace and common defense, lie in the hands of the executive. So if I'm reading this argument and I'm concerned that we have just denounced limited government for all time, and now we're talking about the persons who are going to be executing these powers, executing executive, rule by one, I may understand the necessity of energetic government for common defense, but it's not at all clear to me right now that this government is a limited government.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm an anti-federalist, I'm sounding the alarm right now.
Mm-hmm.
Publius has taken off his mask as a would-be tyrant.
On this point, I need to study more anti-federalist papers, of course. But, you look at what? Cato 4 on the executive. It's not attacking the executive in terms of energy. It doesn't do it. It's really strange. And look, come on. Executive has changed the language enough to where you're not worried about a prince here. It's not king or prince, it's an executive. He executes. What does he execute? Congress's will? The people's will? And you'll say, well, who are you kidding? Exigencies. We didn't underline this enough. Don't exigencies have emergency about them? Exigency, things that happen all of the sudden? Someone flies a plane into a World Trade Center and you have to decide to ground all flights because you're head of the FAA? I mean, that's an exigency. I'd snap my fingers, but it'd probably be annoying through headphones. But on-the-spot judgments have to be made. Dispatch is a virtue we shall see in the executive, and exigencies require immediate attention, and dispatch becomes a virtue.
Yeah, as you note, Congress could not make a statute. Congress could not pass a law that says if a airliner full of fuel crashes into the World Trade Center, then the director of the FAA, which has been already established, shall ground all flights. Those kinds of emergency decisions have to fall into the hands of one person or in his deputies.
We could develop this thinking more through Locke's treatment of prerogative in the Second Treatise of Government. We could develop this thinking more through study of various aspects of Plato, for instance, the statesman, that dialogue. What are the possibilities of law? Because that's another thing that you and I could concentrate on here. Wait a minute, I thought this government was to be limited government by being a government of laws. That's another way. The rule of law means that there's limited government in a sense. But exigencies that you and I are thinking about now are not compatible with the rule of law. Law is general, and it's usually made in light of something that's happened. Now, I'm not talking about ex post facto laws, but I'm saying, hey, we need to make a school zone here. Sometimes you anticipate and make it in advance, but usually it's after the fact. And the nature and variety, to think about it in the way Publius is, of these exigencies is so great that law could not possibly cover for it. So what you have to do is give not enumerated powers, but implied powers. You spoke of enumerated from Article 1. Well, let's go look at Article 2 and see the implied powers there. Look, the means must be proportionate to the ends. If you're going to mow my yard and I've commissioned you with that, you have to have the power to come onto my property. I can't commission you with keeping my yard clean, but not give you a key to the lock to my gate. And that's all we're talking about here. And Publius speaks of this as a self-evident truth in paragraph 5. It's worth thinking about this definition, especially because of the importance of self-evident truths for us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, is what I'm thinking of there from the Declaration. Look at this way of thinking about it that Publius offers us. A self-evident truth is when an unprejudiced mind carries its own evidence along with it. Argumentation does not add clarity to a self-evident truth. It appears as if argumentation can only obscure it. The self-evident truth Publius highlights at this point is the end implies the means. This is a rigid ends means reasoning. And this argument is used as a cudgel against the Articles of Confederation and the anti-federalists who agree on the end of preservation, but don't agree on the means. You and I need to understand the means must be willed if we are to will the ends. You must have the power equal to the task you wish to achieve. So is this a matter of prudence or a matter of natural science? Power must be proportionate to the ends. It's a self-evident truth. That is, the argument here is self-evident, as is this axiom. Power must be proportionate to the ends. So the prudent statesman understands this. Nature understands this. It exists regardless of us. The Articles of Confederation, with its mere petitioning of states to contribute troops and its weak taxation power, must be seen as imprudent and false regarding this understanding of truths found in nature. What do you think about that?
Well, he says in paragraph number 9, not to confer in each case a degree of power commensurate to the end would be to violate the most obvious rules of prudence and propriety, and improvidently to trust the great interests of the nation to hands which are disabled from managing them with vigor and success. So prudence is involved in setting up a government, in outlining its powers, such that Johnny on the spot, let's say, President Johnny on the spot, can react to emergencies, or that Congress would be able to act with foresight to build dikes and dams. And I'm thinking here about the argument that John Marshall makes in McCulloch v. Maryland, where he says the Constitution doesn't say that a Bank of the United States can be created. It does say that Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes, and prudent legislators can decide that a bank is necessary to lay and collect taxes. But that's their decision. The Constitution does not prevent them from doing so. And all of this, as and the end of this paper says, involves in the people to delegate authority to be able to choose what interests the government can carry out and what power they want to confer to their representatives to be able to reach that. So it's not as if we set up a government that is unlimited here and now, and that's the end of the story, right? It has to be expounded. It has to be continually developed. The outlines that Marshall mentions have to be filled in.
And so what we have to understand before we can get there is that the Articles of Confederation fail in their charge. You agree on the ends, and you fail in providing the means to own up to those ends. There must be a change in a first principle. It says in paragraph 8 the following, that if we are in earnest about giving the Union energy and duration, we must abandon the vain project of legislating upon the states in their collective capacities. We must extend the laws of the federal government to the individual citizens of America. We must discard the fallacious scheme of quotas and requisitions as equally impracticable and unjust. The result from all this is that the Union ought to be invested with full power to levy troops, to build and equip fleets, and to raise the revenues which will be required for the formation and support of an army and navy in the customary and ordinary modes practiced in other governments. So it seems just because we're a Republican government does not mean that the usual rules and problems do not apply. You're going to face exigencies. Just because we're Republican does not save us from the nature of the world. This is not some imagined republic, is what I mean to emphasize. Publius, I think, here has the anti-federalist sort of visionary view of Republican virtue in mind with this criticism. So give the Union full power to levy troops, to build and equip fleets, and raise the money, most importantly, required to do all of this. This is needed for the Union to endure. So it needs this in order to come about and to endure.
Here we see the argument for number 15 and 16 about the necessity of the government operating on the individuals and not on the states applied to this argument about security. 23 in some ways nicely culminates so many of the arguments we've seen previously about security, about the nature of government, particularly about confederacies. And like you said, it does come to be about money. Before we started recording, you and I were riffing on what means. And you used a popular phrase, person of means. Mike, what does that mean?
Yeah, a person of means. It's a person of wealth. It means a person has money. Because at first you could say, oh, when you say, oh, he's a man of means, it could suggest that the person has energy, that you're capable of getting things done. You know people. But I believe the actual definition is that the person has money. And so that's what this is about. Energy takes money. In order for the union to have energy and duration, it must have the power to raise money. That's the simple logic here. This is a matter of prudence and propriety, Publius says at the end of paragraph 9. Changing the first principles of republican government away from the Articles of Confederation towards what the United States Constitution has is a matter of prudence and propriety. You must be able to operate directly on individuals, not just make requisitions from the states. That was an understanding of what was needed to secure liberty in the Articles of Confederation. The states mediate everything. Here we understand through Publius that in order to secure liberty, the national government must be able to operate on individuals. This is, again, shaping our understanding of republican government. Publius is defining it in a more complex manner now, not merely representation in an enlarged sphere, but also wherein the government can operate directly on individuals.
So as we near the end of this essay, we hear again an argument for an extended republic, for the Continental Union that we got in the earlier papers. He says in paragraph 10, the national government is the center of information, and therefore the body to which the guardianship of the public safety is best confided. Is there, he asks, not a manifest inconsistency in devolving upon the federal government the care of the general defense and leaving in the state governments the effective powers by which it is to be provided for? So again, we're not talking about stripping the states of all power and dissolving them. We're just talking about putting proper power in proper place.
That's why we have to pay so much attention to the authorities, which we read back there in paragraph 4. You have to understand, well, wait a minute, who's going to build fleets? Who's going to have a navy? The national government is. And we saw the necessity of having that navy to protect all of this commerce that we're going to get involved in. And so, of course, building a navy is proper to the national government, given the superintendence of commerce.
Well, I was just going to add, when we think about this Constitution as being divided between a legislative and executive and a judicial function, we cannot forget that there is also a function proper to the national government and a function proper to the state governments. Publius wants to keep those, although some will have to overlap, as we'll see, separate. But it's necessary first to define them. And we may complain that some of the functions, such as the executive function, are not as properly defined as we might want them to be. And of course, that means that there is more leeway granted to that department to be able to face up to exigencies. But it's very clear right here what the proper role of the national government is to be and what the proper role of states is to be. National government is to be entrusted with care for the common defense, among other things. And the states cannot retain the means by which that national government is to meet that end. Powers are overlapping across the branches of the national government, and that's a necessity to be able to maintain the separation of powers, as we will see. But there's not a suggestion here that the powers of the national and the state government are to be overlapping in a way to prevent tyranny. You cannot have that kind of check by the state governments on the national government pursuant to the power to secure the common defense. That kind of checks and balances does not make good government.
It makes an empire within an empire. And Publius has already helped us understand the problems that arise from empire within an empire. I said earlier that Publius announces responsibility here. This is the first paper in which the word responsibility is uttered. Responsibility is a virtue for we moderns. It's not for Aristotle. You either are or are not responsible for Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, for instance. But here we see responsibility as a virtue. And it is appropriate, in my opinion, that responsibility is said for the first time in a paper which announces how much power this government must have in order to have the energy to keep us safe. So notice the following. I'm going to go up to the beginning of paragraph 10 where you just took us. Publius says, "Who's so likely to make suitable provisions for the public defense as that body to which the guardianship of the public safety is confided, which, as the center of information, will best understand the extent and urgency of the dangers that threaten as the representatives of the whole, will feel itself most deeply interested in the preservation of every part, which from the responsibility implied in the duty assigned to it will be most sensibly impressed with the necessity of proper exactions, and which, by the extension of its authority throughout the states, can alone establish uniformity and concert in the plans and measures by which the common safety is to be secured." I'd like to concentrate on the word responsibility, as I've said. There was responsibility implied in the duty assigned to the federal government. Responsibility is implied in the duty assigned to the federal government. Now, as I just said, this is not the first book to discuss responsibility, but it's the first to use it in this sort of political discussion. Now, for the anti-federalists, like Brutus, responsibility is simply responsiveness to the people. They say jump, and the responsible representative says, how high? For Publius, however, responsibility is beyond mere responsiveness. Think about the context of this paper. You have to meet an exigency, an emergency situation. You have to be responsible. Therefore, you're not looking to the people for instruction. It's an emergency situation. For Publius, responsibility entails a sort of caretaking of the people that here arises from the duty of national defense. And you've pointed out the word care already, Aaron. Its care is said twice in the opening handful of paragraphs here. The new republicanism that Publius is here working through makes responsibility into a virtue. And as a virtue, Publius reconceptualizes virtues that would otherwise be aristocratic. Responsibility as not only responsiveness, but also caretaking comports with Republican government and equality. And this gets wild. The officer or executive who is responsible can even go against the law for the sake of the common good, because the common good is his responsibility, which is here, of course, linked with energy and self-preservation. So let this be my opening salvo regarding responsibility. Let's keep our eyes open for it as we proceed through the papers. I think the question we're left with is how we can possibly rest easily with the federal government possessing all this power. That it must possess this power is something I'm becoming convinced of. The question that lingers now, if we are satisfied that government must have this much power to have the energy to keep us safe, we still can wonder, how is it that we are kept safe from government itself? Government's going to keep me safe from people like Aaron, who want to take my stuff and overthrow my state government, from nasty British government. Okay, fine, I need this government to have this much energy, but what's to keep me safe from our government itself, who watches the watchman, for crying out loud? Let's look at paragraph 11, the second sentence. Publius says, "It will indeed deserve the most vigilant and careful attention of the people to see that it be modeled in such a manner as to admit of its being safely vested with the requisite powers." Now, you've pointed this out in our opening conversation here, Aaron. The people have to have virtues. The people have to have a virtue of vigilance and attentiveness. You can't just go to sleep. This thing is going to take our mindfulness. Notice Publius does not say our responsibility, but one could be inclined to think of this as, well, what's your responsibility as a citizen in this country? The virtues you are to possess, it seems here now, are some sort of vigilance and attentiveness when it comes to the nature of the Constitution itself. And you would say, well, okay, that's only for the people who are seeking to ratify the Constitution. Why does that matter for us? Well, we witness that government power can change in extra constitutional ways throughout American history. So I would suggest that these, if I'm right in calling them virtues, these virtues that Publius announces here are virtues proper to a Republican people, no matter the situation they find themselves in.
Well, and when we said earlier that this involves very little with the states in terms of national defense, that's true, but it presupposes so much of the character of the people, which has to be molded by the states, let's say by the militia in the 18th century or by schools. These institutions, the township, if we're thinking about Tocqueville, these institutions which inculcate a love of liberty and provide, shape the spirit necessary to maintaining them.
So this is a hint of all that's to come in the second volume of the Federalist Papers, because I would add that the people are going to be shaped by Publius as well. But for now, here in Federalist 23, we must keep safe. The extent of the empire, North, South, and Union, that is to be governed along with the nature of human beings and the nature of power, comprise the strongest argument for the energetic government with its energetic executive and Congress that's able to secure the means necessary to attain the ends of government, principle among which is security. That's what I have to say about Fed 23. I really like this little paper a lot. It's shocking, as you said at the beginning, is it not? But hey, so let's just be very clear. What can government not do when it comes to raising armies, building and equipping fleets, prescribing rules for government of both, directing their operations, and providing for their support? Is there a constitutional shackle on the defense budget? Let's just think of it that way. Would that be prudent or imprudent, according to Federalist 23? Imprudent. It would be unwise.
The constitutional shackle is people resisting, let's say, the draft. The constitutional shackle, in the sense that the Constitution is not simply parchment, but also the way that citizens interact with their government, the regime in the more classical sense. The constitutional shackle is my desire not to get my head taxed off. So there's so much more operating here than the general outline that we're discussing.
We could go to Locke's second treatise, the tail end of chapter 13, and of course, chapter 14, which I mentioned earlier, a prerogative power, wherein Locke helps us understand the nature of exigencies all the more clearly. Machiavelli, of course, is going to help us understand this. I believe we discussed this when we did Prince 15. You would have to wonder how much what Machiavelli there describes as prudence is something we could map on this understanding of prerogative in Fed 23. Big difference, of course, being the place of the public good, which is the justification for all of this behavior in Locke's second treatise, chapter 14, wherein Locke describes prerogative as the power possessed by the executive, and he's going to call him a prince there, by the way, to act where there is no law or even against the law for the sake of the public good. That's how it is that this is going to be different from what Machiavelli advises in The Prince. But both of those things should be kept in mind when reading Fed 23, when thinking about the possibilities and limits of law, as you brought to our attention earlier, Aaron, and coming to your decision as a reader of the Federalist Papers and a subject to these powers of government, whether you agree that it is unwise and foolish to place constitutional shackles on the Constitution and its agents regarding the preservation of the Constitution. Because as I said earlier, the preservation of the Constitution means the preservation of the Union, which means the preservation of you. Publius has been making that argument the whole time. I like this paper.
Yeah. And it gives us lots of ideas for future episodes. I think we have to do on the chapter on prerogative.
It's really interesting because with prerogative, it's the anchoring in the public good that means to distinguish it from, let's say, tyranny in the sense that Aristotle would define it. If you just go back to regime types in Aristotle, and at this point, if we're just talking about the executive acting on the spot, we're not worried about having co-consuls and a dual executive, let's say a singular executive. Aristotle is going to define the rule of one in his own interest as tyranny, the rule of one for the sake of the common good as monarchy. So this is the monarchical element of our Republican government. We're seeing the first signs of it here. The way in which, because of necessity, which is what I'm saying here instead of exigencies, this Republican government, with all of its congressmen, with its bicameral legislature, with its separate judiciary, still must rely on the executive. This is why. Real busy times around here. One of the things I've noticed in editing these is every time we've dated things, it kind of gets in the way. We had a cool conversation about pie and Thanksgiving and stuff like that I had to get rid of because it's just like it's April. Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know what else to say. I'm trying to think of a way to close this out.
23. 23 is Michael Jordan's number. It is, what's your birthday?
Yeah, 17th.
Well,
I don't want to. What are you going to ask me? What the name of my first pet? My mother's maiden name? Next? You asking me? You're going through security questions here.
Make and model of your first car.
Yeah.
Security question. No one uses security questions anymore.
They're so, it's remarkable. All of this discussion of security throughout all of these Federalist papers, I don't really have any sense of security when it comes to commerce online or regarding my identity. Identity theft is the way of the world, right? It's crazy. Remember that guy who was so confident in the security of his company's program or whatever it was that he put his social security number on a billboard and drove through the city. Then, of course, was identity thefted shortly thereafter. We just got credit freezes and all of that stuff is the only thing I know how to do. But I've changed credit cards, at least two different times. Get a message from American Express saying, yeah, we found your stuff on the dark web. What is that? Where is that?
It's all out there. I always get messages from my password manager saying my passwords were highly compromised. I remember when Russia invaded Ukraine, upon the expectation that America was going to materially assist Ukraine, the Wall Street Journal published an article recommending its readers change their passwords because Russia was going to dump some passwords on online forums that they had stocked up. So even if your information isn't published online, someone somewhere has it.
Yeah, sure.
It's great.
Yeah. Aaron, been great talking with you about Federalist Paper 23. On to the next one.
I've been excited about this one. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.
This has been the Good Government Podcast with Aaron Slutkin and Michael Hoffpauir.